What's going on, everybody? We are back with another episode of the Escalate Podcast. I'm back in the studio. I decided to kind of clean it up a little bit. My wife has been using this desk and kind of this area of our office for her stuff as a veterinarian. She does a lot of her records here. I was very, very okay with keeping up this space for that, but I cleaned a little bit of her stuff off so that I could film this video. And I'm really excited to actually film this one because it's going to be a little bit shorter of an episode. In this episode, what I want to do is I want to outline one of the concepts in motor learning that I am extremely passionate about, with that being sequence learning. Sequence learning is really, really cool to me because I think it's a foundation of any complex multi-joint movement. If you do not understand from infancy how to sequence your lower limbs to walk, then you will never learn how to walk. If you don't learn how to sequence your limbs for a golf swing, or sequence your trunk and your hips for a golf swing, you are never going to become a proficient golfer. And in the same sense, if you do not understand how to sequence joint actions in a squat, bench, or deadlift, you will not become proficient in squat, bench, and deadlift. So I'm hoping that I'm going to be able to provide some strategies for people that are struggling with sequencing joint actions, specifically in the deadlift. The deadlift, I think, is the one where most people have issues with this, mainly because people get caught out with very, very quickly lockouts of the knees. So their knees lock out very, very quickly. And then their hips and their glutes and their lower back are just kind of there to struggle with the last third, or in some cases, the last half of the lift. So they're taking upwards of 300 kilos, for example, and their knees are only helping them upwards to the point where the bar crosses the knees, and they lock out their knees, and then all of a sudden the quads can't really help anymore. Can't help past that because you're already at terminal knee extended. So in this video, what I want to do is I want to define what sequence learning is. I want to kind of showcase some of the things that we've seen in research settings on how our brain is able to learn a sequence of actions. And I want to give some actionable things with visualization and motor imagery that can allow athletes to properly sequence their knees and their hips in a deadlift. That's the main example that I'm going to be going through in this episode. So, what is sequence learning? Sequence learning can be defined as a process of acquiring a movement skill that requires specific actions in a specific time domain. So I know it's kind of like a lot of flowery language, but essentially in the laboratory, how we define sequence learning is basically a sequence of key presses. Key presses is one of the major ways that we study this. And people will go through and learn a key press of like 1, 3, 2, 4. So maybe they go their index finger, ring finger, middle finger, pinky. 1, 3, 2, 4. Back and forth, back and forth. And very early on, they are slow at this. They do not seem to understand what the sequence is. Maybe if it's also interspersed with random items. So you see 1, 3, 2, 4, and then maybe 6 random key presses, and then 1, 3, 2, 4 again, and 6 random key presses. Then you really just kind of don't understand what the sequence actually is. That's another topic for another day. That's implicit learning, meaning that you don't understand. You can't explicitly tell me what the sequence was, but you learned it. We can see that through data such as reaction time or anything. But to get back on the swing of things, we mainly study this with key presses. It's called a serial reaction time task, where you get a stimulus provided to you, normally in a visual sense. So you'll see a green square that corresponds to 1, and then a green square that corresponds to 2, 3, and 4. And you might see 1, 3, 2, 4 in that pattern. Green squares going across. You might get numbers that correspond to each key press. So you might see the numbers 1, 3, 2, 4 over and over again, and you're supposed to press those as soon as that stimulus is provided to you. So it's a serial reaction. As soon as the stimulus is provided, you react as quick as you can and press that key. Now, very early on in learning, you are slow and you are not as accurate. So you might be fudging up the numbers a little bit. You might be going 1, 3, 4, 2, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 3, 2, 2. over and over again until you finally get very quick and are able to press 1, 3, 2, 4 quickly and quickly. In sequence learning, for longer sequences, we also have this phenomenon called chunking. I won't get too far into that, but essentially you kind of chunk maybe an 8-item sequence into 2 4-item chunks, or a 12-item sequence into 3 4-item chunks, or 2 6-item chunks. And that's just a constraint from working memory. I won't dive that too far into that stuff because I don't think it's too applicable to what I'm talking about. However, what they have been able to see through generalization tests and through transfer tests meaning you train on the right arm, you can transfer to the left arm, you train on the left arm, you can transfer to the right arm. What they've been able to see is that very early on in learning, our brain loves to look at sequences and look at these items of a serial reaction time task in a spatial domain, or a domain that is more relevant to the environment. So instead of them, your body and your brain thinking, oh, I'm going to use my ring finger to press the 3 after I press the 1, what it's actually encoding is, oh, I need to press this specific button in my environment, right? And how they've been able to show that is when they do flip to the other side, if you were to give the same person the same spatial domain, so now 1 is the pinky on the left hand, 3 is the middle finger, 2 is the ring finger, and 4 is the index finger, they're able to do that better than in the motor domain, which would be just the same map from the original one. So 1 index finger, 3 ring finger, 2 middle finger, and 4 pinky finger, flip to the other side. So it's completely flipped. They're really bad at that. They're much, much better at spatial domain, look worse at the actual motor domain. And as you practice, that motor domain gets better and better. We call these things allocentric and egocentric. So very early on, you are allocentric oriented. You are worried about and learning through spatial domains in the environment rather than motor domains that are egocentric to yourself. So allocentric meaning environment or spatial domain, egocentric meaning yourself or your motor domain. So your actual muscles and the actual fingers that you're using within that. So that's kind of what sequence learning is. That's how we're able to define it. And that's kind of a good stepping stone into how I want you guys to potentially start implementing this for your athletes or for yourself if you struggle with the deadlift and the sequence of knees to hip lockout. Now, I mentioned earlier that this is my microphone just splurged out on me. Sorry about that. I mentioned earlier that this is a very common issue for a lot of lifters where you pick the bar up, you're maybe really fast off the floor, you lock your knees out, and then you get caught at lockout, right? And people may attribute that to a poor setup. I've definitely worked with athletes where we improved their setup and we're able to, through improving their setup, we're able to, orient the pelvis or orient the trunk or orient the hips in a way that is able to, properly use the glute fibers and not have them in a short orientation. If you want to learn maybe a little bit more about that, I believe that Steve Denobi has a really good video that I might link in the description here regarding your setup, determining your lockout for a deadlift. However, a lot of times I think people overlook the importance of sequencing the knees and the hips together. Because as soon as you lock up your knees, like I mentioned in the beginning, as soon as you lock out your knees in a deadlift, you are now at terminal knee extension. You cannot extend your knees any further. Your quads are done. They can't really do any more work. It's very, very hard for them to do work in that sense. So what I've been moving my clients towards doing that do have this issue is just focusing more on the actual sequence of the knees locking out to the hips locking out, trying to get that more in a one-to-one frame instead of having, upwards to where the bar passes your knees, having your knees lock out really quickly and then leaving your hips with, a majority of the load, your hips and lower back and glutes with the majority of the load, and you're getting caught at lockout because generally speaking, that musculature is just not strong enough to, finish the lift itself. You're also probably in a poor position. The bar is forward on you. All of these different issues with center of mass. So it just kind of turns into this mess, right? And instead of, trying to figure out the starting position, if they already have a good starting position, then it's like, okay, where do we go with this? Instead of, sitting there and going, I need to give them barbell hip thrust because we need to get their glutes stronger, which might help. I'm not saying that that's a bad idea. It might help, but I don't think it's the main issue. I think 9 times out of 10, the issue happens if they already have a good starting position, but they're still getting caught at lockout. The issue happens where their knees are locking out far too soon before their hips do. And I apologize because I just kind of went, all around the world to get to that final point. And I think that using what we know in the lab setting about how we're able to first learn in a spatial orientation for a sequence of actions, and then learn in a motor orientation once we have become an expert in the spatial domain after we get, tons of reps of practice. I think that it would be very important for lifters to start a visualization process. And what I mean by that is before you walk up to the bar, I've talked about mental imagery before. I think mental and motor imagery before. I think it's a very important thing in powerlifting that's not used enough. I think the power of you being able to look at yourself and imagine the feeling of finishing a lift, hitting a PR is extremely powerful. Not only does it, sometimes fire the same neurons in the motor cortex and surrounding premotor and motor areas in the brain through mirror neurons that happen when you're actually doing the lift. So you're actually creating plasticity or better connections between the neurons themselves and the synaptic pathway down to the muscles, simply through imagining yourself doing these things. But what it also does is it allows you to first imagine it in a spatial domain. So this was a question that actually, the reason I came to this is a question that came to me from my Powerlifting Now video, where somebody was asking me, well, should I imagine myself in a third-person perspective, or should I imagine myself in a first-person perspective? And in my experience, from what I've read, and this, I'm not sure of any of the research that shows third-person versus first-person yet. I should probably read that before I upload this episode, but whatever. From what we know about sequence learning, I believe that it would be extremely important for somebody that's learning how to sequence their knees and hips in a specific way for the deadlift. I think that it would be extremely important for them to first have mental imagery and visualize themselves in a third-person perspective so they can see the environment. And then once they're able to do that and execute it well, and through other cues, that your coach might give you, be able to practice that well, then you can kind of move to this first-person perspective. Again, much like in the serial reaction time task, you're moving from an allocentric, environment-driven domain very early on in learning that can transfer very well to your actual actions. When you visualize yourself in a third-person perspective, you visualize those knees locking out in conjunction with the hips or just before, instead of them locking out, halfway through up the lift. And then as you begin to become an expert in that, as you begin to become competent, have motor competency in that specific technique, then you can move yourself gradually into visualizing yourself in a first-person perspective. So, long story short, the reason why I wanted to film this episode is I think that it's important for individuals to understand if they are going to use motor imagery, which one to use, whether it be a third-person perspective or a first-person perspective. And I think specifically for people that are having issues sequencing their knees and their hips in that lockout position, so being able to lock both of them out at the same time or in short conjunction so you don't have your glutes and lower back and hips taking the brunt of lockout in a deadlift. I think it's important for them to first visualize that in a third-person perspective because it allows them to do so in an environment. They see environmental cues and in an environmental or allocentric domain, and then move over to that motor domain as they become an expert. So that's pretty much all I wanted to talk about. This was a huge ramble. If you guys are interested in this stuff, just let me know. I'd love to film more stuff like this. But this was awesome to film. And if you do have any questions about it, my DMs are always open to talk about this stuff. I'm extremely passionate about it. Obviously, this is something that I'm getting my PhD in, literally my dissertation project revolves around sequence learning. So I love talking about sequence learning. It's very fun to dive into. So if you guys do want to learn a little bit more, hit me up on Instagram or shoot me a DM. I'd love to be able to dive into that. And if you've got this far, thank you for listening to me ramble for, upwards of now 15 minutes. So I appreciate that. And as always, continue climbing. Cool.